Social media made protein a personality trait. Now people are exhausted. The leverage shift starts now. Here is the signal that separates noise from actionable change. We will map trigger, incentive shift, and downstream impact before the close. It became an identity. Fitness influencers built entire careers around it. Supplement companies made billions. And millions of people started defining themselves by grams consumed per day. Now that trend is collapsing, and what replaces it matters more than you think. Here's what happened. Social media algorithmically rewarded extremism. The more obsessive you were about protein intake, the more engagement you got. A 200-gram protein diet became a personality trait. People posted their meals. They tracked macros obsessively. They bought expensive powders and shakes. The fitness industry fed this behavior because it sold products. Supplement companies profited. Influencers gained followers. Platforms amplified the content because it drove time on app. Everyone benefited except the people actually living this lifestyle. The exhaustion set in quietly. First it was decision fatigue. What protein source is optimal? Whey or plant-based? Isolate or concentrate? Then came social fatigue. Constantly posting workout meals felt hollow. And then physical fatigue. Overconsumption of protein doesn't build more muscle past a certain threshold. It just stresses your digestive system and kidneys. Blood work started showing the damage. People realized they were spending money, time, and health on something that wasn't delivering the promised results. But here's the pattern nobody's talking about yet. This isn't just about protein. This is how social media manufactures personality traits around consumables. It finds a health or fitness angle. It amplifies the extreme version. It creates a community around the obsession. It monetizes through products and sponsorships. And when the burnout hits, it pivots to the next trend. Protein is on the way out. The next manufactured obsession is already being seeded right now across platforms. Who does this affect? First, the people who built their online identity around protein culture. Their content suddenly feels dated. Their credibility is questioned. Second, the supplement industry. Protein powder sales are starting to flatten in major markets. Third, the creators and platforms that profited from the trend. They need a new obsession to replace it. Fourth, new users entering fitness spaces. They're now confused about what actually works versus what's just social performance. The deeper implication is about trust. When platforms algorithmically reward extreme behavior, people internalize the extremism as normal. They think this is what fitness requires. What health demands. What success looks like. By the time they realize it's unsustainable, they've already invested financially and emotionally. The next trend will follow the same pattern. Something will be positioned as essential. The algorithm will amplify it. Communities will form. Products will be sold. And burnout will follow. What changes next? 3 things to watch. First, a shift toward moderation content. Creators will start posting about balanced protein intake and calling the old obsession toxic. They'll position themselves as the rational alternative. This is opportunistic, but it'll work because audiences are tired. Second, supplement companies will pivot their messaging. Instead of extreme gains, they'll sell convenience and balance. The product stays the same. The story changes. Third, platforms will start surfacing a new health or fitness obsession. It might be hydration. It might be sleep tracking. It might be something entirely new. The algorithm doesn't care about the topic. It cares about engagement. And extremism drives engagement. Here's what's worth monitoring. Watch creator behavior over the next 3 months. How many will acknowledge the protein overconsumption trend? How many will quietly delete old content? Watch supplement company earnings reports. Are protein sales actually declining? Are they trying to reposition the category? Watch platform algorithm shifts. What fitness or health content is starting to get disproportionate reach right now? Because that's where the next manufactured obsession is being built. This matters because it's not about protein. It's about how social media shapes what we believe is essential. How it turns consumption into identity. How it manufactures consensus around extreme behavior. And how it abandons that consensus the moment engagement starts to decline. If you've invested in this trend, financially or identity-wise, the exhaustion you're feeling is valid. And it's not personal failure. It's algorithmic design meeting human psychology. Understanding this pattern helps you resist it when the next trend emerges. And it will emerge. Probably sooner than you expect. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next. Watch the execution timeline, second-order market effects, and policy response to gauge what happens next.